Hello, and welcome to Mending Chasms, Building Bridges and Community. My name is Leena Sharma Seth, and I am your host. I'm looking forward to being in conversation with today's guest, but first we have an acknowledgement. Canada exists as we know it today because of colonization. While we work to disrupt colonial and oppression-rooted practice in the work we feel called to do at Mending the Chasm, we also acknowledge our presence as uninvited guests on Brant Tract Treaty territory known as the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, the Attawandaron or Neutral, and many other Indigenous communities who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We also acknowledge the harm of colonization that resilient people of the global diaspora have experienced, including displacement, land theft, enslavement, violence, genocide, and cultural appropriation. Our aim is to work in solidarity with fellow community members to heal from the harm of colonization and to reclaim the joy, the inclusion, well-being, and liberation that is every human's birthright. My guest today is jaqs Gallos Aquines. She's an artist, an anti-racism activist, and community organizer. They're dedicated to relationality, seeing power in the unity of reflected identities where we can further explore our strengths in collaboration and address nuance. Welcome, jaqs.
Thanks so much for having me, Leena.
For sure. I know we've been chatting about having a conversation for some time, so I'm excited that we're finally in this moment. So I know I gave a brief intro, but tell us about yourself in your own words.
Well, I am an artist first. I consider myself a musician of many instruments, and I'm also a videographer, a photographer. Also, I am an anti-racist consultant and facilitator. I have a small firm called Capital Calling for Equity, and do many facilitations with nonprofit as well as private sector.
Amazing. And if I might add, you're also the parent of a beautiful fur baby.
Yes, her name is Kaya Papaya Pumpkin. Yeah, I'm very grateful to have met her. I think on a Hutterite farm in Ontario.
Love it. And viewers, in case you don't know, the reason I now have a puppy is because of jaqs' beautiful puppy, Kaya. So let that stand for the record there. So say more about, you introduced your consultancy, and I'm always fascinated with the for equity. So can you say more about why for equity?
I chose that term because I think for many folks in, well, diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism work, I think equity is a term that equalizes access and is an active term to disrupt barriers, systemic barriers. I know that sometimes there's a confusion with equality and equity. I should have had a diagram, but I think most folks are aware of the baseball game with the boxes. And even in a program that I took at a university in Toronto, had a bit of a confusion as to which term is equity and which term is equality. But I named it equity because I think while equality is the ultimate goal, there are different lived experiences that need to be represented in that pursuit. And I think equality assumes that we all have the same lived experience. And I think equity speaks to relationality with equality, understanding how we get to know each other at a very unique lived experience. We have multiple intersections of how we approach our everyday, whether it's gender, abilities, neurodiversity, education, and those all need to be taken into account into how someone is brought into a space or invited or engaged, and allow for narrative sovereignty to speak to what relationality opens up in that
Yeah,
conversation for equity.
sorry, didn't mean to cut you off there. And thank you for explaining that. And I really appreciate the piece around narrative sovereignty. And that might be a new term for some of my viewers. Do you want to say more about narrative sovereignty?
I learned about that term from LMI Tailfeathers from her film Gima Bitsin, The Meaning of Empathy, which came out in 2022 in the middle of the pandemic. Uh, and the Cultural Instigators, a activist artist group based here out of Treaty 7, hosted, uh, co-hosted with the Calgary Public Library a screening followed by a, um, a training on naloxone with Alberta Health Services. The film is about the struggles of a reserve close in the Blackfoot Confederacy, Gaina, that is struggling with addiction and there's a very high epidemic of opioid addiction. And it's not just Indigenous people being impacted, but also many people who live in so-called Canada. And narrative sovereignty speaks to how documentaries often are extractive and exploitative of subjects, whereas if someone who from the community, the impacted community, is speaking and sharing the story itself, it changes the care that's given to people who are being interviewed, as well as the follow-up. Because working in documentary film, sometimes I think producers, directors can dip in and dip out of a community once the story is complete. So narrative sovereignty changes the perspective. I've even just went to an exhibit, a museum exhibit out on the Stoney Yithuka Nation, Stoney Nakoda Nation out in Morley. And museum studies, as we know, is very extractive. But when you have an exhibit created and researched by the people whose artifacts and art and pieces are part of their culture, there's a different story that takes place.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just for viewers, have you ever considered, the importance of having, autonomy of our own over our own stories, right? That it makes me think of a time where I was in a position to support a speakers bureau experience for people with lived experience of poverty. And I remember we had worked with some of our members of our organization who have lived experience of poverty to develop their stories so they could support advocacy and impact. And there was one person that I was working with who said to me one day, I don't think I want to tell that story anymore. And I think she was expecting me to resist, right? But I said, okay, that's fine. Let's pivot. Let's do something else. And for me, of course, like organizationally, there can be some resistance to like, well, we've invested and we need these stories. But I'm like, the story, the person's you know right to their story is more important than the story than being shared. And so just recognizing, and it wasn't something that I was necessarily taught, but it was a feeling in the moment that this doesn't feel right, and so again, this is, I think, when we come back to the notion of equity, it's about giving people what they need, not what you think they should have, right? And so to me, bringing back, connecting that to narrative sovereignty is about meeting people where they are and recognizing we don't own people's stories. We own our own stories. I'm sure there's copyright stuff for anyone in writing and all of that, but I'm just speaking as a human who wants to acknowledge and really uplift what you just mentioned around the importance of knowing the difference between equity and equality. So thank you for giving us kind of an overview of that. So both of us practice in the space of equity, and one of the things that I'm sure we both are constantly coming up against is, how do you build that critical lens for equity? Like, how do you go beyond it being a conceptual teaching to an active practice?
I always come back to relationality, Lena, because uh, there is no one size fits all. You come to inclusive design, and I've learned this from one of my mentors, JD Derbyshire, that one size fits one. And that comes to a relational approach of uniqueness for every individual, for every group. I strongly believe um, in community-based participatory action research, which is really like focus groups that allow space for community members to speak to their needs. And if you're doing a consultation, whether you're doing with a school or whether you're doing with an organization, you have the people who are on front line who are directly impacted by policies, by processes, to speak to what's missing, what's working, opportunities for change, and what needs to go. But directly in my own life, it is asking people directly, like communities, and finding out. And usually people tell you right away if you have a relationship with an organization, or if you have a relationship with the friendship centers, um, with any grassroots groups, you'll have people who are activated citizens speaking their truth and what they need. And the assumptions are always moving. I think we need to move away from assumptions, and also move away from the staticness of a message, because things change, as we've known during COVID, and especially now with the deprioritization of DEI and outright racist rhetoric. It's very blatant right now, and we need to be able to equip ourselves with being able to speak our truths in a moment, and it doesn't have to be eloquent. You can be a bumbling accomplice, a bumbling ally. Just say something, even if if you are in a moment of witnessing or hearing a racist or oppressive language or action. You can say, "This makes me uncomfortable," or "I don't know why, but it makes me uncomfortable." What you just said, like, there's a feeling. There's a feeling of knowing there's something not right in a moment, and we
I
need to
love
speak to
that.
that.
Yes, that makes so much sense. And I'm also hearing that how do we liberate ourselves from the need to be perfect and how we respond, right? That a lot of times we put a lot of pressure on ourselves that, okay, I recognize that's not appropriate, but I don't know if I can see it all the way through, to some sort of conclusion. But like you said, even if more of us were just like, that doesn't feel good to me. Something feels off here. Can we pause? Can we, can we talk about this? Like just to create that space, right? And so that and interrupt harm often as well. I'd say that like what you're asking folks to do is to, as you educate yourself and recognize, when maybe there's a microaggression happening, or maybe, someone's being excluded or overlooked on your team or something. But how can you bring curiosity to that until you're ready to more actively disrupt? So what I like to say is it's a process. Like we are going to fumble and mess up in the beginning, but how can we continue to practice so that we get better at disrupting? So yeah,
Well, yeah, I love what you said about the curiosity. If you notice something, you could say, like, "Why do you say that?" or "Why do you think that?" And because it's not coming from a place of admonition or even authority, it's or shaming. I think shame is the reason why we uphold this idea of perfection. We're always so afraid of being called out, or bringing attention to ourselves. And as we know, people don't like being called out, and so, the invitation of allowing someone to speak to their truth, of like, "Why do you think that?"
yeah, or say
Allows
more,
them
say
to their
more.
own narrative targeting. Sorry.
Sorry, no,
Sorry.
no, and Tina has taught me to wait, but 100% that acknowledgement of of even just saying, say more, I'm curious, right? And sometimes people in those discussions, as they speak and try to explain, they're like, oh, I realize that's not a complete, like that's not grounded in anything. So appreciate those suggestions. Hopefully, viewers, it's something you can reflect on and practice. I want to talk about, I did not want this conversation to end without making sure I talk about this beautiful piece that you put into the world. Home is in the body. 2S LGBTQIA plus Filipinx femme north of the 49th parallel. So tell us about how this work came to be. What was the message you and your collaborators were hoping to put into the world?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It evolved from a Panay Power 2 conference in Montreal at McGill University in 2019. I wrote a grant with the Calgary Arts Development Authority and was able to it was initially supposed to be an exhibit to photograph and interview 40 Filipinx femme of the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus community, and it turned into a book, turned into an anthology where many people contributed stories, prose, poetry, photography, artwork, and Anak Publishing out of Winnipeg was the publisher, and we worked really hard on making sure that we did our best in representing voices that we exist, that different voices exist within that identity as well. And there's maps in there, I was interested in seeing the different languages that come out of the Philippines, because usually we only know about Tagalog, but I was interested in hearing, Waray or Bisayan, and seeing where everybody comes from. That was just so interesting to me. I was inspired by work by Sidaki Black, who did an exhibit that I did the photography for called Resilience. I can't even remember. Anyways, it is, the resistance is, revitalization is real. And it was an exhibit on 20 young Indigenous youth here in Treaty 7 who were doing great things in their community. And I was like, I'd never seen that for my community. I wanted to see that Filipinx queer femme exist. I had not seen many pieces on that. And that was a very long time ago. And a lot of people are asking for a part 2, but there will be an exhibit. I'm looking forward to it at the Calgary Library here in Treaty 7. Oh, sorry, I didn't acknowledge these lands. I am so grateful to these lands of Treaty 7. But
Which is known as Calgary for those of us who aren't familiar with Treaty 7.
Yes, Mohkinstsis and Treaty 7, lands of the Black Confederacy and the Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda and Métis District 4 and 5 now, I believe. Anyways.
Thank you for that. So let me just come back to another question that really, I'm always curious about solidarity across difference, and viewers have probably heard me dance with this question before, but it's especially in these times, in this context that we find ourselves in, it is even more of a conviction for me that we need to build solidarity across difference. So I'm curious about what that looks like for you in the context of creating Home is in the Body. Has it served as a bridge to other communities across difference? I know you last year did something at a bookstore, and so it really has become sort of a bridge. So I'm curious about, when we think about solidarity across difference, was that a part of your intention in creating or co-creating this? And what more would you want to say about that?
I always find there is solidarity across difference within the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus communities. And I'll say specifically racialized folks, but I'm also deeply appreciative of the folks at Argo Bookshop in Montreal. I always feel like I feel safer when I know that there are queer folks in a space. Ella at Argo Bookshop was instrumental in organizing with us. And it was a conversation on navigating the tension of solidarity with the Palestinian movement. Again, narrative sovereignty is deeply important, and relationship building. We didn't have anyone from the Palestinian youth movement available, but there were folks from independent Jewish voices who were present, and we also learned a lot too about the struggle within their own communities, within the Jewish community, of the nuances. But anti-Zionist Jews are many, and the struggle of Palestine is a struggle of anti-colonialism, of settler colonialism, and I'm saying that as someone who was it's a forced migration when it comes to economic disruption of staying in your own homelands. As far as Filipinos, like my parents moved here for a better life in so-called Canada, and there are many advantages as with a passport. At the same time, there are many struggles that I feel in solidarity with Blackfoot and Tsuut'ina and the Stoney Nakoda, all Indigenous peoples here, the water warriors, and because I see that land back, whether you're Filipino, whether you're Blackfoot, whether you're Palestinian, is part of these struggles. It's across the board. And I called this book Home is in the Body, Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus Filipinx North of the 49th Parallel, because a border is a concept, a colonial concept, and we need to see across that so that we understand our historical positionalities and what brings us here and why the struggle needs to be focused on solidarity. And I sigh with such despair, but it is hard to.
I felt that.
Yeah, it is real, but we do need to stay resilient and maintain sumud, which is a Palestinian word for resilience. Like we owe them our resilience. We owe our ancestors resilience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And even in these hardest of times, one of the things that gives me hope or strength is recognizing that of course we know about intergenerational trauma, that we experience, and it lives in our bodies, the harm that our ancestors experienced, but also the resilience, and as we look at the political climate, as like the pushback against DEI, and for me, this work has always been a calling, and I imagine it's been the same for you. And you express it through your art, through your music, through everything you touch. But just recognizing how hopefully we can be those resources to each other, and to continue to build community. And that's why this show is about mending chasms and building bridges over difference. So for me, this book, as much as I'm not from the queer community, and I'm a child of South Asian immigrants to Canada, I really saw myself in this piece, and so appreciate that you reminded me that art is this beautiful bridge in and of itself. And so again, thank you to you and the team who put this piece into the world. So there's a question I also always ask my guests, and it speaks to some of what we were just talking about with respect to resilience and how we keep going, when the things around us are really, maybe creating experiences of despair for us. How do you practice joy and nurture hope? What does that look like for you?
I've been having a lot of dance parties with my dog lately, listening to George Michael, okay? 80s music is a joy for me. Also, I just watch I watch the Grammys only, but the Deutsche, their music is blown up, and I am so inspired by how dedicated, up and coming or new artists are speaking to this moment. and not shying away from politics. I think, the commercial value of neutrality is thrown out the window. I listen to George Michael, so like that's my indulgence. But to stay positive, I listen to what's inspiring me, and there's so many things. There's so many films. Oh my goodness, you need to watch Mo with Muhammad Amir on Netflix. Like make him number one if he isn't already. Watching shows and movies that make me laugh, that are aware of what's going on. We can still find joy in being conscientious and being aware of what this moment asks of us. We don't have to be we don't have to mind numb. I find that far more comforting when I know that I'm not alone.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know you're also a community builder. Gathering folks is a huge part of what you do. So, and I've had the benefit of being a part of some of those experiences or being invited to things that where maybe I would never have thought of, and meeting new people. And so, I take that away from this, and I'm so glad that we've been able to have this conversation. Thank you so much, jaqs, for joining me today.
Thanks so much. Thank you and Tina for having me here. I think that Burlington and Hamilton have very vibrant arts communities and activist communities. There's always so many events to attend. I miss it.
Well, we miss you too. For viewers, I got to know jaqs while she lived in Hamilton, and she has most recently relocated to Calgary. And so thank you so much. And to my viewers, appreciating you so much for keeping the comments coming, suggestions for guests, and just for tuning in each time the show airs. So until next time, keep mending chasms and building bridges in community.